Hi, and welcome to another episode of Making Things. Today I'll be dismantling some recycled lithium-ion battery packs to make my own custom pack for my electric scooter. Obviously you can use this to make just about any pack you need for just about any use.
Right.
Now as you get started, I've got a couple tools here. There's only a few that are really essential. One of them is the voltmeter. The multimeter is absolutely, you need it to know if you're going to be able to salvage one cell versus another. Some of them aren't going to be good, some of them are, and this is absolutely necessary. Screwdrivers. Now it'll vary a little bit from battery to battery, but you're almost guaranteed that they will be using Torx, and at that, most likely security Torx. So the Torx bits that have, that have the little, maybe something with a bit more definite contrast. There you go. Focus on the numbers. There you go. The little holes in the middle there. There. Didn't pay much for these. Plan ahead and you won't be gouged. Just, you know, they cost no more nor less than regular bits. You will need some snips of some sort. I happen to have these big shears as well. I've never actually used them for this kind of project, but I thought it could be useful. Got a spare screwdriver, again, not really necessary. The essential is really, you know, one set, multimeter, and snips. Obviously the screwdriver would go with the bits, otherwise good luck. The long nose or needle nose can be useful, especially when you're peeling nickel tabs. And then this is an electric screwdriver. It's a little toy, and I gotta say, I bought it out of frustration while I was assembling one of these flat packed piece of furniture with over 700 pieces. I was 3 or 4 hours in, and I was just sick and tired of using my screwdriver. If you use a drill on those, you're going to destroy them because it's just particle board. And so I caved and I went and I bought it, and I gotta say, I've been using it a lot more than I thought I would. Now that being said, if you're just getting starting to build up your collection, this is a luxury. Don't start off with this. You can do way better with your money. I mean, just a regular drill is way more important. If you're doing woodworking and impact, way before this. However, if you're looking for, you know, a gift for a handyman that's not too expensive, or if you've got, you know, your basic setup and you're looking to spoil yourself, get a little toy for the workshop, this is actually surprisingly versatile and useful. The other thing we're going to need, I don't have it here right now because we're not going to need it for a little while, but it's going to be a charger for the lithium batteries. Get into that later once we're there though. The other thing I discovered when I got this, and it was probably one of the first tools I ever got that had a little LED on it. I always thought that was, you know, a dumb little gimmick. I mean, if it's more than a few dollars difference, I wouldn't go for it, but I gotta say that's another thing that really surprised me. The usefulness of a well-placed LED on a drill makes actually a really big difference. And I say well-placed because I also have an LED on my right angle drill, and all it does is cast a shadow on your workspace, so it's really useless. Now, this battery was actually wet when I got it, so that doesn't bode well for it, but I guess we'll see what I've got on my hands here. There you go. So now most of the time when you're dismantling these, you're actually going to get 18 650s in there, so they're going to be 18 millimeters in diameter. 6.5 centimeters long, 650. But these Milwaukee's packs actually have a different setup. They have 26 700s. There you go. So 26 millimeters wide, 700 centimeters long, so 7 centimeters long. A bit larger than the usual. And before you start tearing it apart, you can actually test the voltage while they're still connected together. They don't need to be disconnected to get a read on each cell. Now normally when you're doing this, I mean if you're doing this for scavenging for money, for tools, you might want to check the cells before you start dismantling it, so that if the problem is the board, you can try and do it in a way that you can just change the board with one of your other ones, because most likely the cells are dead, but in some rare cases it's just the board, not any of the cells. But in my case, I actually want to take this apart, make a 36 volt battery pack for my scooter. So that's not going to change anything for me. So I'm going to start off with the board. Sorry, I'm not going to be careful, I mean, to make sure that I can easily reconnect the board, is what I meant. However, in my case, I actually want these little plastic holders. Usually they're not this neatly arranged. They don't necessarily always have a plastic casing around them like this, and I was actually going to buy something like this myself, so, you know, be careful instead. And I'm going to try to preserve this thing, the plastic holder. Now obviously you don't want to short this with a metal object, but you don't need to be too scared of touching it. Electricity usually doesn't cross the skin until about 40 to 60 volts, depending on the person and how sweaty you are. At 60, it's almost certain that it's going through. Around the 50 range, it's mostly going to go through the skin. But you shouldn't really electrocute yourself on your hands under 40 volts. Unless you're really, you know, sweaty or something. So you can go at this with your fingers without worrying, really. The biggest thing you want to be careful of is not shorting different parts of the battery. So this is what I was talking about for the use of the needle nose. Just peeled off some of the tab here. Alright, there you go. I should be able to start getting contact on all the cells now, if not most of them. So we're going to be measuring, I hope, obviously, DC voltage. If you weren't aware this was DC and not AC, maybe you should go back to basics first. So what we're looking for is a voltage that's as high as possible. Anything close to 0 is not going to be recoverable. When you start reaching around the 1 volt mark, unlikely, but you might be able to revive it by carefully charging it. 1.5 volt, now we're talking. Usually you'll be able to fix that. Well, usually. You've got a good chance, but as soon as you hit the 2 volt mark, you've got, you know, you got something good. Kind of like how these are built, makes it easy. I just pull on that little tab and it gives me space to work from. Yeah, see, this is the kind of situation I don't like. Now, it doesn't matter as much anymore because everything else is disconnected. So you can't really short it through this battery anymore because it doesn't touch the other ones. But, you know, if I'd done this at the beginning while I'm cutting this, it's really easy to short it back here. So that's the kind of situation you want to be careful of. Now, most likely I'm going to be getting some new nickel tabs and, you know, not reuse these, but until I'm fully set up for it, sometimes you can kind of reuse them to solder. I mean, it's not ideal, but I don't have any nickel tabs right now on hand, so again, it's just a matter of being able to possibly just use them directly to make my pack. Plus I can use alligator clips on those to do my revival charging. Alright, this was a dud. To fix. Dud. Dud. And most likely a dud at 0.95, but we'll give it a shot. It's not that's not too far off to be possible. I mean, just don't get your hopes high up for a you know, a sub 1 volt is all. All right, this is a little later in the evening, and I'm having a little Back to the Future moment here. I was getting a little lazy, and I decided to take out my Dremel with a cutting blade. And if you're seeing this, it means it works, and I'm recommending it. If it didn't, I'm not going to splice this in and look like an idiot. By the way, if you hate this tool as much as I do when it comes to dismantling it, I hadn't used this in, come on, there you go. I hadn't used this in quite a while, and I'd forgotten. Don't try to use a screw, a little screwdriver they give you. Just grab make sure it's unplugged, grab the blade and twist it, and it'll unscrew your screw for you. It'll get it started to the point where you can do it with your fingers. Now, if you don't have one of these, you don't need to run out and buy one. This is one of these tools I'm torn. If someone's getting started, they've just got, you know, apartment space, whatever. Is it a good tool? It does a lot of things. It won't get you through long jobs, but as a gift, in my case, actually I think it was my first power tool, and it truly is a multi-tool in the sense that it's meant to try and do it all. If you're gonna do it, stick to the basics: cutting, grinding, some drilling. It'll do just fine, but don't get the little router table attachment or whatever. This all flexes. It's not strong enough to do that kind of job. But as a cutter, I mean, again, these tend to be a little expensive because of the name brand. I now have, you know, a cordless rotary cutter. Cost me, I think it was $19.99 because it came with no battery, but it works with my other batteries. So, but sometimes it's the only thing that'll do. I would not take that giant tool to a battery pack. Yeah, I'm wrecking my holders doing this. Oh well. Tough not to wreck the holder, which in my case I actually do want to use. Again, I've already got 2, and I'm planning on using 10 cells, so, you know, do the math. Happens to be enough. But still, I wouldn't mind being able to have a couple spares. Let's see how much I'm angled this thing. Yeah, not bad. It still holds. All right. This gets my seal of approval. I don't have a seal. So before I actually get to the point of trying to charge these, while I'm doing this, I'm actually going to explain a little bit how that's going to work. So smart chargers all have protection circuits to prevent you from doing exactly what I'm going to do, which is to try and charge an overly discharged cell. So they're meant to stop you from trying to charge over discharged cells. This is because if you have a dud cell in a pack, it's likely got a short somewhere in it. It's just going to keep sucking up however much energy you get put into it. You're just going to end up damaging things even more. However, we're doing this one cell at a time, and we're trying to figure out if any of them are duds. So we're going to do it anyways. But since these quote-unquote smart chargers won't let us, what are we to do? Well, it's quite simple. We're actually going to put it in, most of them have different modes, and we're just going to put it in NiCad mode, because NiCads are meant to be able to be charged from almost nothing, and so that will allow us to do it. What we want to do first is just try and bring them up a bit, see which ones revive and don't. And when you're doing this more or less quote-unquote seriously, when you're at the point where you're trying to make sure that you know which cell is dead and which one isn't, you have to do them one at a time. But at the very beginning, we can get away with doing it in parallel because we're not going to be going any higher than 2.5 volts. In 2.5 volts, it's still a voltage that's considered a deep discharge for these cells. So, you know. Alright, now to dispose. First off, we're going to need to dispose of these duds. They really shouldn't pose a problem, but just because, you know, I don't want to toy with anything here, I'm just going to remove the tabs. And the reason I'm going to do this is I'm just going to cover the ends with a bit of electrical tape. And you'll notice negative is still a bit of exposed. Doesn't matter because positive end is properly covered because it's narrower than the strip of tape. This is a dual mode charger. I can either use an external power supply for higher voltages, or for up to 18 volts I can just plug it directly into the wall. I kind of like that of it. It was one of the big selling points for me. I didn't want to have to buy a separate power supply because, well, I mean, it's not that complicated, but I really wanted to. My main pack charges from a bulk charger, and I do my maintenance with these little guys here and a BMS. These are battery medics, kind of like, not an external, they're an external balancer. So I have a BMS that's also a balancer. And then on top of that, I can use this for, you know, really doing sections of the pack, but this was really meant for maintenance and such. So having just the power cord was a big selling point for me. So, if you skipped ahead through the dismantling, you might want to go back a little bit. I actually explained what I'll be doing here already while I was dismantling to make it a bit less boring. So I'm going to be selecting nickel cadmium. So you always want to do this at a very, very low current. However, these are very high capacity cells. I'm not too worried about going at 1 amp. I mean, because these can charge, they probably at, I mean, they can discharge at 40 amps safely. They can probably charge at 20 if you're pushing it. 5, absolutely certain there's no problem. So at 1 amp, these are 3 amp hour cells. It'll take just a matter of no, I'm gonna play it safe. I'm gonna go a half amp. Positive, negative, garbage. So anyways, the way that this will work is I'll just go through one cell at a time, try to bring them up to about 3 volts, see if they hold that. If they self-drain too fast, they're dead. But if they work, then if they hold that charge, once they've recovered up to about 3 volts, about 3 volts, I'll be able to use the proper lithium charging program, which is then more or less you know, plug and play. Now, you'll notice that at first the voltage goes up quite rapidly. Oops. And this is normal. It's because if you've ever looked at a discharge curve, what happens is that as the battery gets charged or discharged, you know, if this is a high, oh, there's not enough in view. I'll put a little diagram in the video. So when the battery is just slightly charged, the voltage spikes up quite rapidly, and at the very end, when you're using a battery, the first, say, 10% of a battery will also be accompanied with a pretty sharp voltage drop. So most of the power is used at a what's called a nominal voltage, and that's kind of where it hovers at in the middle for most of the time. So the fact this is going up really fast doesn't mean that, you know, the battery's taking in a lot of power or anything like that. It's just that it's doing its thing. It's been a day. I didn't really have time to charge that many, but I'm still on my third one now for full charges. As far as the partial charges from yesterday up to 3.3 volts, most of them held up pretty well. I retested them for voltage, and it's such a low amount of energy in them that it is normal that they do go down a bit. But there's only 2 of the cells that went back down below 2 volts. The rest stayed pretty stable. So I'm quite pleased with that. So I'm doing full charges right now, and once that's done, I will be doing a discharge test, which allows me to measure the capacity that's held within the cell. Now another thing I did do, I haven't shown yet, I took out my little IR thermometer. Never do this unattended. I mean, I could have been done by now if I just let them on when I went to work or whatever. That would have been really dumb. I mean, it's not, especially because these are manganese, manganese or magnesium. I don't remember. Anyways, they're not, you know, cobalt-based cells, so they're not the ones that do the big flaming explosions you see on YouTube and such. But they're still, you know, you don't want to leave it on its own. Again, I mean, I mitigated the risk by ditching all the ones that were way too low, but yeah, there's just no point in taking useless risks. But anyways, as I was saying, I also took out my infrared thermometer, and so what I do is I can point it on the cell while it's charging, and so far, I mean, these are really high quality cells to start with, and even though I'm pumping you know, a couple amps through them, despite their age and how long they were sitting unused, completely discharged, they're actually not warming up at all, which is a really good sign. It means the internal resistance hasn't gone up. So that's a good indicator. I mean, if you get through to, you know, reviving them a little bit where it looks it might be worth charging, you start charging them, and you see the temperature start rising really fast, you just, you know, chuck it. That's it. That one's dead. It means that you've got little crystals that formed inside, metallic deposit that formed crystals inside, and that's creating a short circuit, and it's just gonna dump all of its energy within itself. That's when you get catastrophic failures, and that's super dangerous actually. That can cause a fire, especially in more volatile cells. If you're talking the LIMN cells like these, odds are it'll just swell and that'll be the end of it. Same goes with lithium iron phosphate cells. They wouldn't be very unlikely to catch on fire. Now, I don't want to say they never would, because obviously someone's going to prove me wrong if I say that. So, you know, still got to be smart about it, but I tend to try and stick to the more stable chemistries. Yeah, see, this is pretty much at room temperature still, and it's been charging for a half hour now. So, I mean, that's really good. I'm super happy with these. I'm starting to get my hopes up. I said I was trying not to get my hopes up all throughout the video so far, but I'm starting to get my hopes up now. So I'm almost done going through the cells. I've only got one last one to do for the first pass. The next step is going to be to try and see how much capacity these actually have by discharging them. But before I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect them all in parallel. Not necessarily all of them. Some of them, as I was saying, have turned out to be a bit sketchier. Now this charger here in the corner indicates how many milliamps are being pumped into the cells, and these two here, and actually this third one that I just took off the charger right now, took a lot less of a charge than the other ones. These are 3 amp hour cells out of the factory. Obviously, I didn't expect anything near that, but they've been getting anywhere around 1 amp hour. However, if I put them back on the charger, they have been able to take in another about half amp, and they keep it. So I think it's a bit of a matter of just how long they were resting. These are very high quality cells to start with, so I don't know how much I can actually bring them back up to life a little bit. But as I was saying, the next step is going to be to put them in parallel before I try to put more power into them, just because now that I've already got a pretty good idea of how much power is going into them, and they're all at a fairly stable voltage within 0.2 volts of each other, which is usually about as far off as you want to go to prevent issues in your pack, especially with lower C rated cells, but these are very high rated anyway, so that 0.2 volt difference, it'll be able to handle the current from the cells balancing off. But what'll happen is by putting them all in parallel, I'm going to have all the cells even out, and then I'll be able to plug it in as a single cell and trickle charge it back up, just to really see how much I can get in each of those cells at once. For the simple reason, I don't necessarily want to spend another 3 days going through all of these cells one at a time. And the only reason it takes so long is because I'm doing this really only when it's 100% supervised. So it's taking me seemingly forever for that reason. It really isn't that long, but still I've had to be sitting here the whole time. Luckily I'm just working off on the side, but it is a bit annoying. So anyways, time to do the last cell. And again, this is one of the cells I'd rated as being least likely to be good. So based on how much of a voltage drop they had over the first night, if you remember. And so this is a D-rated cell. I made myself a little rating here, and I actually have to boost it up first back to a usable voltage. Now this isn't very surprising, since even getting it up from under 2 volts to 3.3 volts is we're talking only about 4 to 8 milliamp hours, which is really nothing. So if there's even the smallest internal discharge, which wouldn't be unusual for any battery really, every battery has some internal discharge. In fact, cheap cells like cell phones probably have a higher internal discharge than some of these damaged high quality cell. However, that little bit that is discharging, it's really easy for it to go down under, so I'm just putting it on the NiCad mode again and giving it a little boost. And now I'm going to start the lithium program. So I was saying, boost them up, but on the flip side, the higher quality ones, the ones I rated A and B, they actually stayed above 3 volts. In fact, the A rated one stayed above 3.3 volts. So there's really a big difference here. So we're talking about having lost 10, 20 milliamps over the first night versus having lost maybe 5 milliamps on these other ones. So and sure enough, my D rated so far have only been charging up 150 to 450 milliamps, so they were likely going to be chucked. These are my two of my C-rated cells. They're doing seemingly okay. I'm going to keep testing them a little bit. They might be useful just as one-off cells, but it seems like I got really lucky, and I have exactly 10 cells that are keeping that 3.8 and above voltage. So at 3.8 volts, it would mean that they're actually at about 40% capacity. And if I can get, and I've got some of them that are still hovering above 4, so if I can get them to hover at around 4%. That would be about 60% capacity. That would be pretty good. So I've made myself a little setup to hold the cells. This is just a 1 1/4 inch hole. 1 inch would probably work, but it'd been a bit tight. I prefer just letting the cell rest or just wedging it with a piece of wire. And then I have my helping hand and a piece of wire that I'm going to solder onto the tabs. Now the reason I'm not just using the tabs directly is, although this one is actually really nice and long, a lot of them are fairly short, so that would be an issue. And also I don't have a spot welder, and I want to keep the flexibility of being able to dismantle the thing as I go. And now I do want to parallel charge them, but parallel discharging them would not help me figuring out what the capacity of each cell is, and that's actually a pretty important thing to do. So having pigtails like this is going to make my job quite a bit easier. The other thing is this will reduce heat transfer, because I can just solder easily the copper onto that little nickel tab rather than trying to solder directly onto the caps of the batteries. So that'll reduce the risk of damage to the cell from heat. And also, if it turns out that the capacity is a bit too low for my scooter's small pack, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to reuse these to make a spot welder, because they are very high quality cells, capable of 40 amps continuous, probably in the neighborhood of 60 to 80 amps instantaneous, which is actually considered 30 seconds or less. So when we're talking about 200 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds, these cells can probably output close to 100 amps without it causing an issue. So this is actually the first cell I do, so I'm using one of the lesser quality cells just because, you know, it's probably a smart thing to do. So that took me about 7 seconds. Let's see how hot the base got. So that's good. Yeah, so the temperature is quite a bit higher at the top, and you know, just going down a half inch there along the tab, I can already see the temperature cut in half, and by the time I get back down to the cell, it's still pretty much at the temperature it was before it started. A little bit warmer, but I have no problem touching this with my fingers, and I wouldn't do the same at the top. That would hurt. So. And that's good, because this is one of my longest tab. It's another reason I picked this tab to start with. You know, my shorter tabs, the amount of give I have is about this distance anyways. So the fact that I can go ahead and touch right below where I was soldering, that's a good sign for my shortest tabs, which are going to be about this length, about a half inch. So I'm just going to do a bunch of those in a row. So see you in a bit.
So it might be hard to hear me now. I have my fan running and I'm wearing my respirator. But just to show you, I made a slightly larger hole to start with. Now what I'm doing is I'm just bending over the first pigtail, and that way I don't need extra space to get this done.
So it occurred to me that I was talking about not wanting to put too much heat into the cells, but then I proceeded to use a torch without explaining why using a torch was the best way not to put too much heat in the cells. Well, it's a matter of total energy that you put into the cells, not the amount of energy you put on the spot. So if you use a really hot element, such as the butane flame, you can melt the solder in a matter of just a few seconds, maybe as little as 3, no more than about 7 seconds. I was timing myself as I did it. And even that, if you touch after that, the base, it's not going to be too hot. But if you were to use, say, a 35 watt soldering iron, Well, actually, if you try to use a 35 watt soldering iron on 14 gauge wire, you'll probably be poking at it for a couple minutes up until several inches of it are really scorching hot. Whereas when I was using the flame on here, I could touch the wire right after, just an inch or two above. So it's a matter of not letting the cell act like a giant heat sink that absorbs the heat, cooling off the area you're trying to tin, and in the process you're building up internal heat until finally this is hot enough. So you want to avoid that. So by using a torch, we get to heat that little tab really quickly so that the tin sets onto it without the cell having time to absorb a lot of energy. So it's really a matter of total energy, not spontaneous energy. Well, actually it's both, but you get it. So I've made a bus bar out of an old piano wire holder. It's a P-side ket. I really like how it's working out. I'm probably going to be making a better version for myself later on. But right now it's not necessary. This will be more than enough. But it's definitely the kind of thing I'd like to build later on. So in case you don't know quite what I'm doing, I am putting all the positives with the positives, negatives with the negatives. I've got that big piece of copper in the back, acts as the main conductor. And just screws with washers that go in those holes. That was not very smart. The fun of a magnetized head is that I don't need to line it up first. However, if I forget that, I misalign it when I get too close because it pulls the screw back. So what I've essentially done here is I've built a massive cell. So it's now a single giant 3.6 volt battery, and because they're all in parallel, as I'm charging it, whichever ones are already full are going to discharge into the other batteries. Now this doesn't work with all types of lithium ion. I'm not saying you should always do that, but any cell that's capable of outputting really high current safely will generally be able to do this. So lithium iron phosphate of a decent quality, lipos, and lithium manganese, and more actually as the technology is progressing, it's getting actually pretty easy to find cells that are capable of discharging at a sufficient rate to do this. But nonetheless, just make sure it's capable of at least a few Cs, 2 or 3 Cs, so 2 or 3 times the output of its nominal charge capacity. So if it's a 1 amp hour, should be able to output 2 to 3 amp hours. If it's a 3 amp hours, you want it to be able to output 6 to 9 amp hours. Otherwise, if you've got say a 6 amp cell that can only output, we'll go with that. So let's say you have a 12 amp hour cell and can output 3 amp hours. That would be a cell that's optimized for its energy density, not for its output capacity. And doing this, it wouldn't be able to handle being charged and discharged at the rate necessary for this kind of thing. So you don't necessarily want to do that with high energy, low output cells. So high capacity, low power cells. So what you want to do that with is high power cells mostly. It's not to say it won't work with other types of cells, it's just not going to work as well. And so far I've been able to put in almost a full amp hour. And they really seem to be taking well to this extra charging. When you store batteries, you want to keep them at 40 to 60%. If you read detailed things, they'll tell you 40%, but if it's going to be long-term storage and you're not going to be monitoring it, and there might be a slow discharge in the cell, well, there will be a slow discharge in the cell, then pushing it up 60 to 80% is still probably a preferable long-term storage voltage, only because as it drops you're going to go down to a safe voltage. So if you check it every 6 months or every year, depending on the size of the battery, it'll be fine. The smaller the battery in terms of amp hours, the more of an issue it can be. But if you've got a 12, 16, 20 amp hour battery. If your BMS isn't, so your battery protection circuit isn't very mediocre or outright terrible, it shouldn't be sipping too much power, and you really should be able to leave the batteries at 40 to 60% no problem for well over a year. I know my 16 amp hour lithium iron phosphate pack can do something like a year on 5 to 10% of the battery. So if I were to store it at 40%, I would have no issue checking it every year, year and a half. But on a smaller pack, or a pack with a somewhat lower quality BMS that's taking more current out of the pack, that could be a serious issue. You could discharge it by accident. Alright, so it's been sitting there overnight, and everything stayed pretty stable actually at 4.05 volts, so that's really good. And I started the discharge test now. I was having trouble doing a faster discharge. It would just, the device would cut off really quickly. But the voltage was fine. It wasn't even dropping to the cutoff, so it's going to take longer, but I'm going to be discharging each cell at 0.5 amps. So if the cells are doing good, that'll take about 3 hours per cell. So that's going to suck, but oh well. So the capacity testing is pretty much coming to an end, and this is likely going to end up being used for my spot welding setup. I do have a few that are at 1.5 amp hour capacity, but most of them are more around the 1 amp hour to 1.2 amp hour, and I doubt my D and C grade cells are going to be able to make up for that unless I got amazingly lucky, but they're not going to be 1.5 amp hour cells, and that's fine. I have lithium iron nanophosphate, so nanophosphate is mostly a marketing term, but they are A123 cells, which are actually incredibly high quality. They're 1.1 amp hour only, but they're 18650, so they're quite a bit smaller, and I've got enough to use it as a 2.2 amp hour rig. And this was for a very short range setup for my scooter. We're talking about 2 kilometers, so just slightly under a mile, for getting in and out of the office from the parking lot. So these are going to be used for my spot welder. Now, as it turns out, my lower rated cells ended up being quite a bit worse than my higher grade cells. If you want more details on that grading system I've made, check out my Instructables. There's a lot more on that there. So as you can see, I've already started assembling something with these. If you want more details on that, I'll be posting another video in the coming weeks. If this was helpful to you though, please like, subscribe, leave some comments, leave your feedback, and have a good day.